Hello, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Julia Chen. I am the Activities Director at the Yale Club, and I'm so excited to see so many of you joining us tonight for our virtual lecture series, where we bring in a live speaker to do a talk and a Q&A that you can participate in from your homes. Today, we are excited to welcome Professor Paul Freedman. Professor Freedman is the Chester D. Tripp Professor of History at Yale University, where he has taught since 1997 and has served as chair of the History Department. His primary interests are in the field of medieval European history and the history of food and cuisine, and he has produced many related books and articles, including Food, the History of Taste, which won a prize from the International Association of Culinary Professionals and has been translated into 10 languages. This began a series of studies about the role of food in shaping cultures and historical trends. Professor Freedman is also the author of the book 10 Restaurants That Changed America, and his newest book, American Cuisine, How It Got This Way, was just published last fall. Today, he's joining us to speak on a very timely topic. What will restaurants look like during the transitional period between lockdown and the end of the pandemic? How many will survive, and what new models will be successful? While answers to these two questions are necessarily tentative given the fast-changing situation and the difficulty of predicting attitudes and behavior, the history of restaurants provides some clues as to what the so-called new normal will look like. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you for joining me for this talk. This is obviously a speculative talk in the sense that I'm not in the restaurant business. I don't have the crushing responsibility of figuring out whether to fire people, whether to stay in business as a takeout service, how to adapt to a new world, or whether to decide to close. But the purpose of the talk is partly, from my point of view, to use the past to think about the future, which is not what historians always do. As a medieval historian, the job I was originally appointed to, I'm interested in the past for its own sake, and much less in the sense of, the lessons of the past. But in the history of food, there's certain kinds of cycles, trends, persistent phenomena. And so I do think that in order to speculate creatively about what is going to happen to restaurants, some notion of their function in the past and their adaptability might be useful. Particularly eager to hear your thoughts on this subject. So I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be spent on questions and answers. The magnitude of the pandemic is so immense, so shattering, and as we're seeing, is involved in many phenomena that don't have to do with the public health emergency, at least not directly. It's hard to find parallels in the past. A lot of speculation or easy comparisons are made with 9/11 and its consequences, or with the financial crash that began in 2008. And I think these are significant. After all, some famous restaurants like L'Espinasse in New York closed after 9/11 because of the lack of business, and a very large number of restaurants went out of business in 2008, really in 2009. But the response of people in both cases in New York tended to be a kind of local patriotism. I'm not going to let 9/11 prevent me from having a normal life, or at least I'm going to go out to support restaurants and businesses. And somewhat similarly in 2008. Obviously now this is hard, although many people have tried to keep their local restaurant or their favorite restaurant in business through takeout and delivery. But I would say that the point of comparison, historical comparison that is closest, is actually Prohibition. Prohibition, as you know, is the constitutional amendment passed in 1919 that was repealed in 1933, and it outlawed the sale of alcoholic beverages. In doing so, it wrecked the business model of the high-end restaurant. Up to that date, high-end restaurant meant French restaurant. Not necessarily slavishly following the French example, but the menus were often in French, even when they described American dishes. The kitchen was organized according to the French, and most of the dishes were more or less French. And to have French food without wine was not really an attractive idea. And also, then as now, restaurants made a lot of their money on alcohol. Liquor does not deteriorate. It has a very high markup. And very importantly, now, there is a limit, even in the fanciest restaurants, to what you can spend on food. There is almost no limit on what somebody who's determined to spend a lot of money can disgorge by way of wine. So the finest restaurants in New York are happy to sell you a bottle of Montrachet or Romanée Conti for upwards of $5,000. And indeed, a friend of mine who's a maitre d' at one of the leading restaurants in New York told me that they of course they rate their customers as VIPs, but VIPW means someone who's in the habit of spending a lot of money on wine. So in the 1920s, very few restaurants of soigné service and fine food were able to survive Prohibition. The mood of patrons was summed up by a man named Arthur Nees, who had been a regular at Delmonico's, which closed in 1923. Delmonico's still exists, I would say parenthetically, but it did not from 1923 until the end of the 20s. Nees said, "No more the grape with fire divine shall light the torch of pleasure gay, and where the gourmand paused to dine, hot dogs and fudge shops have their day." And this is important because not only, because restaurants didn't disappear during Prohibition. The high-end, fine dining restaurants did, but they were replaced by casual and lower class options, those fudge shops and hot dog stands of the poem. Prohibition didn't stop alcohol consumption, as we all know, but speakeasies were not places where people went to dine, obviously. And they might serve expensive snacks, kind of like nightclubs. And very popular at speakeasies and nightclubs, like the Cotton Club in the period, was Chinese food, wontons, egg rolls, and the like, or other salty, savory items that kept customers drinking. But these are not the building blocks of gastronomy. Prohibition was repealed in 1933 at the depths of the Great Depression. So the repeal didn't do that much to restore high-end dining. Then the Second World War brought rationing. So elite dining was not really back until the late 1940s, 25 years after the category had become virtually extinct. What is similar now to what happened in the 1920s, I believe, is that the restaurant business model will be fundamentally altered. We don't know in what direction exactly, but it looks like, as in 1920, it will be altered in a more informal direction. The demise of high-end restaurants in the 1920s was filled by coffee shops, roadside places. This was when Howard Johnson's got its start. luncheonettes, the automat, so-called ethnic restaurants flourished, particularly those like Chinese restaurants that didn't depend on alcohol for their success. This time, and let me say, I truly, truly hope I'm wrong, but this time I'm afraid we're going to see a much wider devastation. And I think we'll see a similar impact on fine dining, but it will also affect a lot of restaurants that are not places where you'd order a $5,000 bottle of wine. My estimate is that even with government financial assistance, at least 50% of full service restaurants that existed at the beginning of March 2020 will be permanently gone by the end of the year. The Restaurant Association has the figure at 75%. So I am actually an optimist comparatively. The James Beard Foundation estimated 70%. The impact will be mostly in New York, San Francisco, and other places with high rents. The high rents mean that it's impossible to make money following the cheery advice of, oh, just have 50% of your tables empty, or just have 50% capacity. New York restaurants were not making a whole ton of money, even when they were filled night after night. At some point, commercial rents will come down, but it will be too late for many of the restaurants that now exist. That means that actually probably new people will open restaurants or old people will open new restaurants. I think that within a few years there will be a lot of restaurants, maybe not as many as a few months ago, but they will not necessarily be run by the same people, and they will not be run necessarily according to the same. The great unknown is what is about to take place now. We are entering a transitional period, which may look a lot like the emergency period, and we're going to find out very soon. What if the new normal looks a lot like the transitional period? The longer the transition goes on, the worse off restaurants are going to be. They're going to have diminished capacity, which may be good in New York, at least for the customer. Social distancing. The waiters are going to wear masks. Maybe you'll have to have your temperature checked before you enter. There are going to be plastic partitions. Parties over 4 people or over 6 people will be banned. How is this not going to look like a, TSA checkpoint in the airport? Who is going to be attracted to this? Well, one hopeful thing is pent-up demand. People may be so eager, longing for their familiar pleasures, that they'll flock back to restaurants at the first opportunity. Whether they're going to be willing to pay money, a lot of money, for food served with these kinds of protocols is in question. And who are these plucky early customers going to be? On the one hand, older people are shielded more from economic disaster than younger people. They have accumulated money, or retired, or are not directly affected by the disastrous unemployment figures. But they're going to be slow to venture out because older people like myself are more susceptible to the disease, and the disease has worse consequences on them. The younger demographic, the mainstay of restaurants in hip cities, may not have as much money to spend on dining out because they are affected by the economic problems. And you can tell that young people are or were the favorite customers of restaurants because restaurants are or were noisy. when I was giving talks about my book, 10 Restaurants That Changed America, the question I was most often asked, particularly with audiences of older people, was, why are restaurants so noisy? And part of the answer, besides the fact they don't have as much carpeting, tablecloths, and sound-absorbing stuff as they used to, the main answer, though, is that younger people think a restaurant is failing if it's too quiet. Younger people like a buzz, and that means a certain amount of noise. Again, when restaurants are only half full, they'll be quieter, all right. But I'm not sure that is the way we desire it. Okay, so it seems to me there are three major obstacles to restoring restaurants the way they were just a few months ago: logistics, money, and behavior. The restaurateur Tom Colicchio recently said that restaurants are really cultural institutions, and they deserve public support, just as do museums and theaters. Again, what kind of cultural event will it be to go out to a restaurant and running the gauntlet of inspections? Executive at the consulting firm Pantellect Incorporated, a man named Bob Golden, said, quote, "I think we are all learning we can live without restaurants. After all, people stuck in their houses have either taught themselves how to cook or become reaccustomed to it, or they've ordered takeout and delivery, which is part of the restaurant experience, but is not, as I'm going to discuss in a minute, what made restaurants attractive to people." So actually, I don't think people will give up restaurants cheerfully. I don't think they're going to cook at home in great numbers. They're going to continue to order takeout and delivery. And what is really going to suffer is not cooking at home, not takeout and delivery, but the sit-down restaurant. So what restaurants are and why they are important to us. These are significant in predicting what the survivors are going to look like. That is to say, if you think about why we have been going out to restaurants in such large numbers, I think you can speculate about what restaurants will look like in the future. People go out to restaurants not just to satisfy hunger, and not even just for gastronomic curiosity. They go for social reasons. Things like cementing business relationships, seduction, celebration, becoming acquainted, saying goodbye, networking, paying back obligations. It is these relationships that have to be restored if restaurants are to flourish in the future, not just the desire for someone else to cook your meals. From the beginning of civilization, there have been places to get food outside your home. Travelers depended on inns. Cities always had takeout options. They had sort of the ancestors of food courts and food trucks. Practical, utilitarian eating is part of urban societies, but restaurants have only existed in particular times and places. The restaurant in its modern form started in 18th century Paris, and it was unique because it offered choices. As opposed to the set meal of an inn or tavern, the restaurant ordered choices from a menu. As opposed to the set time of a meal at an inn, or a table d'hôte, as the ancestors of restaurants were called. A table d'hôte is a place where they say, come at 1 o'clock and we will give you a meal. Restaurants offer a choice of times that you can come. And then finally, choice of people that you dine with instead of a common table or just getting the food and taking it home. You eat with the people you showed up And that's the most important aspect, eating with the people that you came in with, for the social aspect, interaction aspect of restaurants. There were no restaurants in medieval Barcelona. There were no restaurants in colonial Boston. It is possible, therefore, to imagine a civilization that does without restaurants, although for us, it wouldn't seem probably like a very attractive civilization to experience. The restaurant, as we know it, is a place of structured sociability. Bars, parks, clubs, lecture halls, virtual lectures in a way, sporting events are examples of gathering places that have nothing to do with home or with work. The restaurant grows out of institutions like taverns or cafes, whose success was built on social interaction. The restaurant offers elaborately, or at least sometimes elaborately prepared food rather than just drinks and snacks, thereby creating a different kind of experience with certain rituals and a kind of complexity. For people who are away from home or who don't want to cook at home, the restaurant is now a necessity rather than an occasional luxury. Before the pandemic, people in the United States spent more money on dining out than at home. That first occurred in 2015. Sitting down together to a meal, what in academic jargon is called commensality, creates, confirms, or extends relationships. That's why our first instinct in wanting to get someone new, wanting to get to know someone new, is to plan to dine with them. Hollywood is aware of this. Virtually all high-grossing blockbuster movies include at least one scene of people eating together. A professor at NYU named Fabio Parasecoli investigated more like 160 blockbuster movies defined by their gross. Only one of them, and I think it was one of the Star Wars movie, does not have a scene of people eating together. And that's not because the directors are fond of gastronomy. It's because we're not talking about movies like Big Night or Babette's Feast that are about food. It's because it shows character. It gives you a chance without words, without using too many words the way that novels can, to show the nature of people's character. Think of Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. She has dinner with Edward Lewis, played by Richard Gere, who demonstrates his arrogant savoir-faire by his confident gourmet expertise. Hastily, Julia Roberts tries to learn something about culinary etiquette, although remember she has trouble with the snails when manipulating them. We learn about her. We also learn about this guy. His guests walk out. He's a corporate raider, and he's humiliating his guests deliberately. And once he's humiliated them, the dinner's over. It's been merely a vehicle for insulting his victims. So from the single dining experience, we learn a lot about Edward's predatory character, and we learn about the likably awkward and plucky Vivian. Or another movie example is Twister. This is a movie about chasing tornadoes in Oklahoma. And its hook is that this dangerous job is supposed to be a male monopoly. But in fact, of this group, the best is the female tornado chaser, Dr. Jo Harding, played by Helen Hunt. And everybody acknowledges this. They know that she's the best. There's a scene at the home of one of the guys, and the wives are in the kitchen preparing a meal while the men are chatting in the den. And Helen Hunt is not welcomed by the women in the kitchen because she's not one of them. And she's still kind of a stranger, out of place with the guys as well. So food in this case, not eating it, but preparing it tells us something about this in-between character and what she faces. In the modern world, restaurants are the venue of choice for social mingling. Long before there were restaurants, taverns provided a convivial atmosphere, but it's an alcoholic atmosphere. Convivial, but usually male and often featuring fights and stuff like that. Coffee houses provided a more intellectual atmosphere. Caffeine is very good for things like the first insurance company was found, modern insurance company was founded at a coffee house. The Royal Society was founded at another one in London. But restaurants have a greater versatility than coffee houses or cafes. They have profited as places to talk with social or intellectual or business associates. So I'd just like to talk about the four biggest aspects of this kind of interaction. And once again, the reason I'm doing this is to get us to think about what it is that we like about restaurants, or what it is about restaurants that makes us dependent on them. So the four things are romance, friendship, celebration, and business. To start with romance. Historically, there have been many ways of meeting potential intimate partners: arranged marriages, mixers, 1970s fern bars, online dating sites. Restaurant meals are not a place to initiate a relationship, but rather a follow-up to an initial encounter. In the analog world of the past, acquiring a girl's telephone number allowed the guy to suggest a movie, an excursion, a party, but most often a restaurant meal. You may remember the 1993 movie Sleepless in Seattle, which is a good example of the pitfalls of restaurant dining with romantic or potentially romantic companions. Remember this? The guy played by Tom Hanks has decided finally after his wife's death to start dating again. And his male buddies shake their heads and tell him it's a jungle. You won't recognize it. Everything has changed. For example, does he even know what tiramisu is? And he doesn't. And they assure him that women love it, and he's going to get to know tiramisu intimately. So, of course, the world changes. And now, actually, the interactions between men and women have changed a lot since the days when women often would have a meal before a date at home so that they wouldn't appear to be too hungry. Now men apparently like women with a good appetite. The New York Times, at least, had an article a couple years ago about women ordering steak when on a date, or at least an early get-acquainted meal with a guy. They order steak to reassure the guy that they don't have food hang-ups. It's not that the guy is worried about their hang-ups. It's that he's worried that they're going to tell him to stop eating meat or eating, fattening food, or to have a more healthful diet. Friendship. So friendship has more than dinner. Right? Let's do lunch is not a romantic kind of invitation. Let's do breakfast is maybe a different kind of romantic invitation. But breakfast, in many small towns, old cronies get together for breakfast, for example, at a McDonald's or at a donut place. And this is kind of the opposite of courtship, because the point is not to find out about people. The point is to listen to stories you've already heard, to swap anecdotes and random observations with people you know very well and probably have known for years. And this kind of camaraderie used to also be characteristic of adolescent socializing. I'm not obsessed with movies, but think of movies like Diner, about a group of guys graduating from high school in Baltimore who meet at a diner all the time, or American Graffiti with its hamburger stand. But now millennials, Generation Z, conduct a lot of their lives online. High school students and college students, to some extent, are so overscheduled that they don't have as much time for random hanging out. The third form of friendship over meals is what's covered by the dismissive term "ladies who lunch," the title of a song from the musical Company by Stephen Sondheim of 50 years ago. The first time middle-class women were able to have lunch in groups was right after the Civil War. At first in sequestered private dining rooms in restaurants, by 1900 in places that catered to women, like Schraft's, which I featured in my restaurants. These attracted women who were shopping or women who worked in offices or retail. Unlike the male cronies I mentioned earlier, these women could be of any age. The reason that the men at breakfast are old is that most men who are not retired, men of professional and executive ranks, feel it's a waste of time to just have non-business related meetings with friends. Turning to celebrations, this is the oldest form of group dining. Roman banquets, Native American potlatches are examples of collective feasts. In our society, most celebrations are family-oriented, anniversaries or birthdays. The meal can be part of a celebration, as with weddings, or it can be the center of a celebration, a birthday party that's held at a restaurant. Finally, business socializing. Meals provide occasions to talk face-to-face about sometimes vitally important affairs. Restaurants function as places of contact, connections, and news. Some people need to be at the same restaurant all the time because that shows that they're in the game. As Al Sharpton said about Sylvia's in Harlem, you had to show up from time to time, or people thought you had retired. Describing lunch at the Four Seasons in the 1970s, the advertising notable Lois Wise said, "The center banquette is always mine." The barroom has a great business atmosphere, particularly for women. Even Jackie O can't take my table away from me. The tables are far apart, and there's no romance possible. So in order to gain this favored status, she had to show up very often. She had to have what restaurants called a negative reservation. A negative reservation means you call if you're not going to show up. If you don't say anything, they'll assume you're going to be at your regular table. This is fallen into desuetude. I mean, there are certain jobs like publishing, certain fields like publishing, where there's still a lot of dining out, but other media don't anymore, and certainly finance, banking, real estate are not as interested. Maybe the gerontocracy or retired people in these fields still dine out. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. So, is the restaurant as a social scene going to return? I'd say yes, but diminished, because the sit-down restaurants, as I said before, are going to be the hardest to resurrect. Once we move from emergency to transition, takeout and delivery will flourish. The most discouraging aspect is that before the pandemic, fine restaurants were financially marginal. I imagine you saw, many of you, the article by Gabrielle Hamilton, the chef and owner of Prune, in the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago. This is someone who won 4 or is it 5 James Beard Awards, who won an Emmy for a PBS program, the author of a cookbook translated into 6 languages. And yet before the pandemic, she could not afford health insurance. She had been closed 1 day a week, but could not continue that. The restaurant opened in 1999. It has 14 tables. They were always full, and in recent years, she barely broke even. She likened in that article closing Prune permanently. She hasn't decided yet, as far as I know, but she's tempted to. She said it would be like, quote, quietly walking out the back door of a building that has been burning for a long time. The most prestigious restaurants are likely to survive because they're beloved and well capitalized. But as one of the comments, the first comment I think was, Noma is doing cheeseburgers now. That's right. Noma in Copenhagen probably will be able to become a fine dining restaurant again. So the cheeseburgers are kind of first stage. But an awful lot of restaurants that are fancy are going to stay at a kind of informal. The chef and owner of 11 Madison Park, Daniel Hum, has said they're going to this is formerly the top restaurant in the world, according to the 50 best, and still in the top 5. It's going to be less formal. It's going to be less expensive. Or it's going to be more expensive. That is hard to imagine because now some restaurateurs say, now we're just going to have to level with people. You can't have this experience for a piddling $400. So even Noma, though, Noma has the advantage of it has money from the Danish government. It is very, very famous. And actually, they are used to closing for months at a time because Rene Redzepi would go to Mexico or Australia and still pay the people, even those that he didn't take with him. But they're dependent, as all the 50 best are, on a kind of international clientele of people who go around, travel constantly, sometimes go just for gastronomic experiences. And I think that's going to change. I know in Barcelona, which is the city that I know best in Europe, that restaurateurs have discovered that now they actually kind of like serving local people. One restaurant gave up serving a kind of very expensive langoustine because, first of all, they didn't really want to anymore, and they wanted to free up langoustines for local people to buy in the market. It was almost impossible to buy these particular, I think, cigales, as they're called, because high-end restaurants took them all. So what is going to happen to celebrity chefs if the survivors are serving cheeseburgers or other modest dishes? I'm very interested in the crisis of the celebrity chef model and can talk about that a little more. It was already under threat. The old male rascal or lovable rascal model was taken down by #MeToo. So I leave the future of gastronomic celebrity as one of the many open questions. And there are other open questions. For example, what's going to happen to Chinese restaurants? Before the pandemic, there were about 40,000 of them in the US, more than McDonald's and KFC combined. There was already a sense that they were in decline, partly because parents raised children who were successful professionals, and the parents were not eager for them to perpetuate the business. The advantage of Chinese restaurants is that they already know how to do takeout and delivery for the most part. Another advantage is that as family businesses, they're not as dependent on employees. On the other hand, discrimination has meant a turning away from Chinese restaurants. They were the first to be devastated even before the lockdown. Also, many of the small-town Chinese restaurants across the country are buffets, and buffets are not going to come back for a very long time. The company OnePlay that tracks credit and debit card transactions says that right now 50% of the Chinese restaurants are no longer taking cards. That's not that they are not processing cards, but that they have given up the machines, the connections, which would suggest that they're going out of business. So, which are the restaurants that are most likely to survive? Restaurants in small towns, restaurants in states that never really had the kind of lockdown that we've experienced in New York, restaurants in rural areas with low rents, restaurants that were already informal. So, a barbecue place in rural Alabama that has picnic tables is not going to suffer. I'd say also restaurants that are cherished. I hope so, cherished by their neighborhood people. Well-capitalized chains. One of the unfortunate things that's likely to happen in New York is that there will be more chain restaurants and fewer independent, quirky restaurants. So as happened during Prohibition, new restaurants and new type of restaurants will come along. We can hope that they'll be more interesting than the mediocre innovations of the 1920s, but they're going to be furtive and sketchy at first. There will be new ways of socializing as well as a new atmosphere for dining. As I said at the beginning, I'm not claiming predictive powers. I'd love to have my pessimistic outlook turn out to be completely wrong. But there's no sense hiding the likely outcome of the present crisis. The cultural trait of American optimism is a useful personal survival tactic. And I think it's a way of overcoming some obstacles. But as we're seeing, reality is a way of surprising us. And those surprises are sometimes unpleasant. So I'm eager to answer your questions or to respond to your comments. I've seen some of them as they've come in.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Freedman. And I do have to apologize. I think we had some sound issues, a little in and out, but I'm hoping everyone got the main messages that the professor was trying to deliver. We did have, and we'll open for Q&A, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And while you think of them, we did have that first question from Carl asking, you mentioned Noma as a specific high-end restaurant in Europe, but do you think the same thing will happen that you described US cities to Paris, London, Tokyo, other major cities around the world?
I think so. Somebody pointed out that Parisian dining is a little more outdoors, but not in, they have cold weather too. Tokyo will be the interesting example because Tokyo has the highest percentage of meals taken outside the home, even larger than New York. So, people are dependent on it. As with New York, but even more so, many people don't really have what you could really call kitchens, places that you can make more than a cup of coffee. So I think London will be a lot like New York, but none of these cities have been as locked down for as long. And have had quite the same rate of cases and fatalities for the disease.
So we have a question from Kathleen asking, if restaurants are forced to exist at 50% capacity for a sustained period of time, say for a year, approximately how much would they have to raise prices in order to compensate?
50%. If you take the Prune model, that is, if they're going to have 7 tables and not 14, just to survive, they would have to charge double. That means then, of course, they'll have to simplify the menu. So that's why they're serving cheeseburgers, or why there will be fewer elegant options, because while you may be willing to pay more for pasta, there are certain limits on how much people are going to be willing to pay for that kind of restaurant experience. So, and of course, restaurants are hardly cheap as it is
But you mentioned that, I mean, restaurants are more than just the food that you're getting. Do you think that they'll be able to capitalize, encouraging people to come back for these experiences that you mentioned?
It depends on what the transition looks like and how it lasts. So, if the experience is one where you're always watching a waiter to make sure his or her mask is on, or where they're wiping everything off, or whether you're getting plastic cutlery, what kind of experience is that?
I think we had a question from Robert, which you might have answered, but I want you to address. Do you think fine dining in suburban or urban areas with significant residential density will succeed, while those in city centers with little or no residents will suffer? People will be working from home and dining nearby.
Well, I think that suburban places are likely to do better than I would have expected when the lockdown began, because a lot of people are going to continue to work at home, meaning people in places like Pelham, New York, which is where I live, are going to stay home rather than take the train, and they'll use local restaurants. Also, these restaurants have adopted to take out because people have cars. Again, it depends a lot on how much money they borrowed, that is, how leveraged they are, how much money they're able to make on takeout. So I think for the time being, takeout and delivery is merely a survival strategy. And we may find out if it's a medium-term strategy, one that allows a restaurant to survive for a year.
Great. So we have a whole bunch of questions that just appeared at once, so we'll go through them in order.
Okay.
What do you think? What do you expect to be the impact on small restaurants by single chefs versus big high-end restaurants, particularly in big cities?
Interesting. So these kinds of places with a single chef have the advantage of a few employees and also knowing their customers. So they ought to do better. On the other hand, restaurants have no cash reserves. I mean, they're businesses that, and particularly a place like that, it would seem would be likely to go out of business very quickly. Also, they might go out of business and then start up again. In other words, the chef can just walk away and then come back, say, when rents are lower.
A question from Lorraine, which I'm a little scared to hear your answer for, but I think high-end restaurants will become super exclusive, more club-like, and the prices will reflect that exclusivity. What do you think the impact will be on private clubs such as ours?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think the Yale Club offers more than dining. The squash courts, the using meeting spaces by companies or other groups. There are people staying at the club. All of these things restaurants are not going to be able to compete with. But of course, I'm very interested in club dining and have been working on a project. So, I'm very interested in what club food is, why clubs are appealing. I'm trying to do a comparison between London and New York clubs.
Great, and I'll be excited to see that when it comes out.
Yeah, don't hold your breath, but that is what I'm working on.
So next question, how do you think this new reality will affect the practice of tipping? Will more restaurants offer higher hourly wages like the European model in an effort to keep a more stable workforce?
Very interesting question, and I don't know. On the one hand, the pandemic is reorienting people towards social justice and tipping as an issue of social justice because the waiters get more than the back of the kitchen people. But if restaurants start to survive, they're going to have to depend on money coming from somebody else besides the restaurant. that is to say, tipping. So I would guess, but it is a guess, there will not be any immediate effect.
We have a question from Robert asking, won't the lack of theater, opera, concerts, things like that make the situation even worse? And could they improve when they all open up again?
Yes, and this is related, I'm glad you asked, because this is related to tourism. When are people coming back to New York? As with Barcelona or Venice or other cities with tons of tourists, they're irritating, and maybe you'll find that the city is more walkable and more interesting without them. But the economic effect is certainly not good.
A question from Mary asking, could you discuss a scenario where smaller cities with much lower rents might be able to attract high-end diners, for example, with specialized culinary experiences?
Yeah, I mean, Nashville, where I used to live, is a culinary destination. Charleston. These places, however, don't have negligible rents, and they can't charge the same prices as New York and San Francisco. So actually, I think they are experiencing maybe a less urgent version of the same thing.
Great. And I want to read Mr. Fullerber's question, but I'm afraid I can't pronounce those.
Yes, I know the restaurants he means. These are two very old restaurants, Can Culleretes in Barcelona and Botín, which figured in Ernest Hemingway's novels in Madrid. One hopes that restaurants that have been around in some form, Botín has been around for hundreds of years, will survive this. They survived the Spanish Civil War. Other restaurants survived World War II. But classic restaurants are closing all over the world. I was told by a friend in Haifa that the oldest restaurant there, a seafood restaurant, has closed permanently.
Well, that's very sad. I don't know if you have any more questions from the crowd, but as a closing question, what can we do? What do you suggest we do to support these restaurants that we
love? Well, support the restaurants. I say this as someone who's been doing a lot of cooking lately, but try to go to them. I'm curious to see, just as I'm curious to see what teaching at Yale is going to be like in the fall, I'm curious to see what a restaurant will look like. Beyond that, there are various sites, Union Square Hospitality Group, for example, the Danny Meyer Restaurant Group has opportunities to donate, the James Beard Foundation, Chef Jose Andres, I forget what the name of his organization is, but it's easy to look up. They're feeding frontline workers and also raising money for restaurant staff. So I guess that's probably the best thing.
Great. Well, do you have any other closing remarks for us, Professor?
No, thank you, Julia. Thank you to members of the Yale Club. I should say that I am a member myself, and I can't wait to get back. And here is a final remark: the democratization of food via YouTube and videos. I hope for a democratization of food that's not just, we're all eating poorly, some kind of 1984 or Moscow 1950 scenario. I think it'll be better than that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Freedman. This is fascinating. I can't wait to see how restaurants return. I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you, everyone, for attending the lecture. We have a lot more content coming up. Check the calendar, and we hope to see you at one of them soon. Until then, stay home, stay safe, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.